Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. I want to continue on my discussion with the musculoskeletal system, but particularly pay attention to the ability of the movement and the control of that system. So in order to move, skeletal muscle needs to contract, and that force needs to be transmitted to the bones. And so remember that tendons are connecting my muscles to the bones, and they can be the conduit for transmission of that force. And the bursa, as I mentioned, is the sheath out over the tendons that allows them to slide over relatively easily. I need to have bones on which to apply forces, and the ligaments that connect one bone to another can also transmit those forces. I need to have joints that allow for the movement in various directions. And as I've mentioned to you before, there are certain types of joints, such as synovial joints, that allow for articulation of two bones via cartilage and synovial fluid that are encased in a capsule. And those are examples, like I said, on my fingers. They're also on my wrist, elbow, shoulder, hip, knee, ankle. Those are the joints that actually I'm talking about. I need a control system for being able to do this. In order to have a control system, I need to have it under some sort of a conscious control, which is controlled via my brain as well as my peripheral nerves. I do have a spinal cord reflex that I'll talk about also. And I have to have sensors to be able to give me feedback on the tension and the length of those muscles. So let's talk about some movements. I'm going to talk about specific types of movements. These are not an all-inclusive, but these account for a lot of the movements that are made. And so there are some general principles related to that. So one thing that happens when you move is that you have around some sort of joint, you have some motion. And I'm going to adjust myself a little bit and talk about this. So if I focus on my elbow, all right, in order to have a movement of my elbow, one such movement is such that I could decrease the angle between parts. So my distal or further away from my body part relative to my body, my distal end is coming towards it and is decreasing the angle that is here at my elbow. This is called a flexion. If it's extension, it is increasing that angle. Now, I also have the possibility of rotation. And if I rotate a joint, then I can either rotate it towards the center of my body or away from the center of my body. So if I look at my shoulder, all right, if I look at my shoulder joint, then if I rotate towards my body, that is referred to as an internal rotation. And if I rotate it outside or further away from the center of my body, that's called an external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. I can also move something away from my body. That's called abduction or abduction, or towards my body, which is called adduction or adduction. So I can abduct my shoulder, or I can adduct towards that. Another movement is that I can move towards my head, or what's called in a superior direction, or away from that, which is an inferior direction. If I move towards a superior direction, for example, I could move my shoulders up, I could elevate them, or I could depress them. So elevation and depression. I have some very specific movements for certain joints. If I look at my forearm, now my arm is containing only one bone, the humerus, but my forearm has two bones. It has the bone closest to my pinky, which is called the ulna, and the one that's closest to the thumb, which is called the radius. And those two come together at the wrist so that I can actually move my forearm in this way. So if I rotate that forearm such that my palm is up, I call that supination. If I move it so that it's down, it's called pronation. Supination, pronation. Similarly, for my ankle, I have a few different types of specific motions. I'm going to adjust my camera here so that you can see this. But if you look at my ankle, if I actually move my ankle so that you can actually see it, if I move my foot down towards the plantar surface, this is called plantar flexion. If I move it back, it's called dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. If I move or tilt my sole of my foot or my calcaneal bone, I can move it either towards or away from my midline. All right. I can move it outward, that's called eversion, or move it inward, that's called inversion. Eversion and inversion. So I mentioned to you prior that you can actually look at muscles and where they attach and tell something about what's happening. If I want to flex a joint, such as my elbow, I have to have the muscle run across that joint. So first rule is, in order to move a joint, you have to have a tendon that goes across the joint so that the force can be transmitted across that. It has to also be on the axis that you expect that movement to occur. So flexion and extension of my elbow has to occur flexion on this side and extension with a muscle on this side. In order to rotate something, I have to have a connection that's going to rotate it, so I have to have a torque that's applied. So I'll have a connection that will wrap around some bone. So those are things to think about when you're thinking about movement. Let's try some. Let's look at this. This is the biceps muscle, which actually has two different muscles that are together. And the first thing, when you think about what a muscle does, you could memorize all this, but a lot of this is just understanding the location of the muscle, insertions, and then to recognize that only a muscle can shorten. That's the only thing it can do. So, whenever you see a muscle that's attached to the skeleton or a portion thereof, the first thing you have to do in order to figure out what the action of the muscle is to look at the skeleton and see the orientation. I hope that you can see by looking at this person's face that they actually are looking forward. So this is the front part of the body, and the muscle in play is right here. The second thing that you should do is to look at where or which joint that muscle goes across. Now in this case, it actually, you could say it's going across a shoulder, but it certainly is going across the elbow. It is not doing anything on the wrist, which is down here, which excludes that as a possibility. So all that means is that all of these things cannot possibly be the case. Now, if it's on the front side and the muscle shortens, that motion is called flexion. That's right. So this is, the biceps is a flexor of the elbow. Let's try another one. Let's try this. This is the deltoid muscle, which has 3 different muscles that are within it. And it is, as you can see, across the shoulder joint. This is the front of the person. And so it's inserting down on the humerus on this side. And this is the big muscle where a lot of times you get a shot that's here. And so if you contract these muscles, think about what you're going to do. If you contract and you're connected up here, you're going to contract and move. That's not going to be an extension or a flexion of the elbow, because it doesn't go across the elbow, or of the shoulder. It's going to be an abduction. of that because it's going to contract and move up. And you can feel on your own body about this. Let's try another one. How about this? All right. This muscle is actually located on the front or the back side. I hope you said the back side. You can see the person's spine here, and you can see the back of their head. So this is the back side. And this is actually in the scapula, your shoulder blades. This muscle is located here. And as you can see, it wraps around the humerus. It wraps around there. So because it's wrapping around there, it's not going to lift it up. It's not going to push it down to any appreciable extent. It's going to actually apply a torque. And it's going to actually move the shoulder, because that's the one that's pertinent here, and it's going to rotate it. So if it were rotating towards the center of the body, then that would be an internal rotation. In this case, it's on the back side, so when it shortens, it's going to externally rotate. In order to internally rotate, it would have to be across the front. And you can feel that in your own muscles contracting when you actually do this. This is an external rotator of the shoulder. And you should think about this, and you can use your own body as a cheat sheet, if you will. What do these different muscles do? So that you develop a skill that as long as you understand that muscles shorten, you understand orientation, then you can picture what motion or motions that muscle actually can do. Well, let's talk about muscle contraction. Now, as I mentioned, each muscle is going to have the actin and myosin, and they're going to overlap at a certain amount, but there's an optimal length for generating the maximum amount of tension or force on that muscle. And that's where you bind the most myosin to the actin. And since both ends of the muscles are fixed, what that leads to is two different types of contraction. All right, type number one is called isotonic, constant tone. Isotonic contraction is where the muscle contracts under that load and shortens. The tension or the constant force is what's constant. That's what leads to movement. That's what we're doing when we're moving our muscles, is isotonic contraction. But it's also possible to do another type of contraction, which does not lead to movement, but instead leads to a force being applied. These are isometric contractions. I don't shorten. For example, if I push my forearms together, I am actually applying force. I'm not moving at all, but I am actually applying a force which is increasing depending upon how much I push together. Or I could pull apart. These are isometric contractions. Now, whether I'm doing isotonic or isometric in particular depends upon what I'm trying to do. If I'm trying to lift something up or hold something, if I'm trying to move it, then I'm going to isotonically contract. If I'm trying to hold it, then I'm going to isometrically contract. And you know from exercise, you might have different types of exercise that are either isotonic or isometric. Well, if you're doing this, how do you generate more force? Well, what you do is you recruit more myofibrils that are in parallel. So for example, for me to hold up my hand doesn't require as much, but if I put a weight in that, I would have to apply more force in order to hold that up, and that would be recruiting additional myofibrils. You don't have to think about this. Your body has learned to do this. And if there's nothing, no load whatsoever, and you contract, the velocity with which this is occurring will quickly go away, so that if I'm like trying to flex my elbow, if I'm trying to do that, if there's no load, I don't hit myself or something like that. All right, I need a sensor system to do this. The main sensor system that I have in my body, in my muscle, are going to be the muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles are a structure that basically goes through the muscle, in which you have these neurons, these nerve fibers that are going around a central portion of the muscle, but the muscle itself doesn't contract. It's not got actin and myosin in it. And these neurons, excuse me, these nerves are firing at a certain rate. And when the muscle itself is contracting, it changes the frequency with which those are firing. So I have this central portion where I have this nerve that is bound around this central portion. It is firing at a certain frequency, and when that frequency changes, it tells me that I am having movement, basically. And so my muscle spindles are allowing me to detect that movement. And you can see this in a lot of different ways. One of the things that you can see in this is what's called the myotactic reflex. The myotactic reflex tells me that when I stretch a muscle or a tendon, which is connected to the muscle, very, very quickly, that quick excitation causes a reflex arc that causes opposing muscles to also contract so that I try to oppose that motion. That way I don't try to move this way and start hitting myself or something like that. And this is found in a couple different ways. So one of the ways is that we test this with reflexes. So I pulled out my handy dandy reflex hammer, and I will show you on myself about the myotactic reflex. So if I get up on my desk and I actually strike my patellar tendon just below my kneecap, it doesn't jump out or something like that. It actually will go back and forth a time or two. And normal is for it to actually go back less than 5 times. The myotactic reflex is also what will make it so that if you try to recap needles, that will actually come into play. So this is not a needle or a cap. This is actually for plugging in to charge into to mate with a USB port. But I wanted to show you when I pull this cap thing apart, as I do it, as I stretch it, as soon as it comes apart, there's no force. And so I will have a reflex arc that will basically oppose and push things together. So I'm pulling apart, and then it will try to push it back together. So let me see if I can demonstrate that to you. Good. All right, let's try it again. Try it again. And you can see it go back. And that's why you never recap needles. If you were to recap a needle, when you try to pull the needle apart, it'll try to push back down and you'll hit yourself again. The functioning of this is to prevent this jerkiness with motions. We don't have jerkiness with our motions for this. And if we do have that, that's a problem in the neurologic system and causes what we call clonus. Now, I also have another type of sensor that I'll just touch on called the Golgi tendon organs. And these basically are sensory organs to detect if the muscle is going to tear itself apart. So these are really a control system only if you're going to do damage to the muscle for the most part. And so what happens is that when you increase tension considerably, it inhibits that muscle and tries to make it so that you don't tear the muscle apart. It is not used by you in your daily motions in most of the types of activities that you have. So I've mentioned about this reflex arc. So one of the things that we have is the ability to protect ourselves from noxious things over very, very fast time frames. Even though the signal travels in our nervous system very rapidly because it's an electrical signal, if it has to go up to the brain and then come back down, it still takes a little bit more time. So some things are mediated by what's called a reflex arc. So for example, when I struck my patellar tendon, it caused a stretch in the muscle spindle, which went back to my spinal cord and then back out to try to make it so that I didn't actually keep contracting and pull my foot up considerably. It also sent a signal back down to the backside so that I could pull my knee back down. And it also synapsed with neurons that would go up to my brain that could then come down. That's more pertinent for noxious stimuli, like if you step on something or it's hot or something like that. So those reflex arcs are there for protection. So if you were to step on something sharp or step on something cold or hot, you would withdraw from that stimulus, and then you would actually recognize that you had that noxious stimulus. Sometimes things go wrong with this. If you cut or sever the spinal cord, such as in traumatic injuries, and there's no longer signals from the brain, then that cord function below will actually stop, and you have no such cord function, and you have no reflex arc, you have no nothing. We all have the experience of a muscle spasm where maybe I've exercised too much and I've irritated my muscle, and what happens is the pain will cause stimulation of the neurons to hold the muscle around that joint that's sore or whatever to protect it from movement. And that will then cause a spasming if you try to actually move it. Another thing that you may have seen are people that have strokes in the past where part of their brain has died, or cerebral palsy, where there is what we call spasticity, and that there's a damage to the brain or to the spinal cord, and that damage leads to a decrease in the synaptic inhibition of those muscles, and they're more excitable. And so the muscle spindles are more excitable, and so you get increased muscle tone and more of a less fluid type of movement. I hope I've given you some introduction to muscle movements that deal with the musculoskeletal system and show you ways that you can actually predict this. I know that it never made a lot of sense to me that you would memorize a lot of muscles and their actions, but instead if you visualize where they were, where they connected, and you knew some general ideas of physics, then you could tell what a muscle would do just simply based on where its connections were and the fact that you knew that it was shortening. So I hope that that model will actually help you with this. As always, if you wish, please subscribe to this channel so that you can get the access to these videos. I hope that you find them helpful. You're welcome to like them or give me feedback or comments. And I'll see you in the near future.